Growing up in Stamps, Arkansas in the 1920s and 30s, Maya Angelou heard about a number of scandals involving black men and white women. Many people are aware that there was significant racism, whereas others may have been more aware of the significant poverty. In this passage, in I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, we'll use the CRIP process to look more closely at how racism and poverty informs the scandal in Chapter 6. To do this, we'll be using the 6 steps of CRIP, Close Reading Interpretative Technique, which are paraphrase, observe, contextualize, analyze, argue, and reflect.
Do step 1, paraphrase. Paraphrasing consists of the speaker, their actions, and the main points of the passage. This helps the reader by simplifying the passage to simpler meanings and basically making a summary. To begin, let's start by reading the passage. Once he heard how Mr. Coley Washington had a girl from Louisville staying at his house. I didn't think it was so bad, but Bailey explained that Mr. Washington was probably doing it to her. He said that although it was bad, just about everybody in the world did it to somebody, but no one else was supposed to know that. And once we found out about a man who had been killed by white folks and thrown into the pond. Bailey said the man's things had been cut off and put in his pocket, and he had been shot in the head, all because the white folks said he did it to a white woman. First off, we know that the speaker, Maya Angelou, A, describes a conversation with Bailey about Mr. Washington, who has a girl at his house that he does it to. B, is told by Bailey that everyone does it to someone but doesn't tell. And C, here's an example about a man who got his things cut off, shot, and thrown into a pond by whites because he did it to a white woman.
The next step is to observe. Observing is actually looking at the text rather than what it's saying. To do this, the reader looks at the textual elements such as descriptive detail, word choice, word repetition, sounds, ideas, imagery, and changes in vocabulary tone. This is a good time to grab a pen and really mark up the passage with good observation. First off, let's look at the form of the passage. For instance, despite being 11 lines long, the passage is only 5 sentences. Second, let's look at the descriptions and the adjectives, such as white folks and white. They allow us to see the difference in races as Maya talks about the man, his victim, and killer. Next, we'll look at another choice in language. During the passage, Maya uses half of the sentences to refer to doing it, but never really actually says what the act is. This helps us to see just how innocent Maya is at the time.
Now that we can understand the passage, let's take a moment and look at the context of the passage, namely historical and biographical. This step is known as Step 3, contextualize. First, let's think of in the case of a scene about local rumors in Chapter 6, we might think about how often recorded instances of sexual assaults happened in the South in the 1930s. Likewise, we might consider how separate white and black were in the South in the 1930s.
Now we move on to Step 4, Analyze. In this step, we will review the features and context we found in Steps 2 and 3. Then we will explain how these features are potentially significant and how each is in fact significant. We'll ask questions such as, which of these features and context seem somehow connected, and in what way? After we've selected 2 textual elements and 2 contextual frames, we'll make analytical claims about their significance. For instance, we could claim that because half the sentences refer to the phrase doing it, conveys how abnormal or scandalous the act was during the time. We could also claim that because Maya refers to white people as white folks, it helps to explain to us the differences between the 2 races, black and white people in Stamps, Arkansas. Additionally, we might claim that because Bailey never describes in detail what happened, it conveys anonymity and leaves us wondering what happened in greater detail.
Now we'll move on to Step 5, Argue. Here we make a few sentences to a paragraph that helps build upon our responses in the Step 4 prompt. This passage shows Maya implies a difference in society between blacks and whites. It shows us just how infamous these accounts were, even to children. The fact that they try not to include too much detail in their statements about Mr. Coley Washington and the man show a reluctance to talk about the awful acts, even when it's talked about by their parents. And finally, we come to the last part of the CRIP process, Step 6, Reflect. Now we'll reflect on our interpretation of the passage. We'll ask ourselves questions such as, what aspects of the passage remain confusing? What elements do we neglect or set aside? What parts of our argument now appear debatable or questionable? What objections can a reasonable person raise about our interpretation? In our passage, why is it so important to relate to the thought process of the kids? Also, the fact that Bailey also never finishes his statements about Mr. Washington, along with the details of his account with a woman, is often neglected. We also focus a lot on the fact that Bailey doesn't finish his statements, meaning they must not be very important to us or him. And finally, a reasonable person could argue with us that we may be looking too much into the fact that these accounts are shocking to kids, since it seems they are fairly commonplace during this time.